Now we're going to add a little bit of complexity to what we've done so far. So everything we've talked about up until now has just been one single React component. But in practice, you'll write many components and you'll use those components to create other components. In this video, we'll have two objectives. First, we'll render an array of JSX, and then after that, we'll refactor it a bit to use a React component inside of another component. So let's get to some code. Here's our component from last time. Remember, it's a pet component. It's got a div, our name Moxie here, a picture of Moxie, and then a list of her hobbies. So if we take a look, it looks like this. So we've added some styling and some classes to make it look a little nicer than before. But let's do another refactor now. Let's say if we have a variable number of hobbies down here, and we don't want to have to list them out by hand. So one thing we can do is we can create a JavaScript array. And now we've got 3 things in that array instead of 2. Now we can use curly brackets inside of our JSX to render this array into JSX LIs. So let's change this to be hobbies.map. In our map callback, we'll transform these strings into JSX elements. So I'll start out with H, that'll be the string for my hobby. And then I want to return an LI that renders H. And I also don't want to forget about my style, so I'll add my style here as well. All right, so if I remove these, now I have 3 hobbies instead of 2, sleeping, eating, and cuddling. But if we look in the console, we'll see that we have a warning here that tells us that we need a unique key prop for each child in an array iterator. This is happening because of the map that we're using. Map returns an array, and anytime you render an array in React, you need to give each element a unique key, which is important for React's rendering. So let's add in that key. And the key should be a unique number that has something to do with the data that we're displaying. Unfortunately, we don't have a great unique number right now, so I'm just going to use the index in the array. And that's not really a great unique key, because if the array ever changes and we lose an element or add an element, that ID, that index could change. But in this case, our array is never changing, so the index will be okay. Now, as you can see, the error goes away, and we still have our list here. Now we've successfully rendered a list of JSX components. For our next task, we're going to refactor this to use 2 components instead of 1. So we'll simplify the pet component and add a new component that the pet component uses. We'll start by creating our new component up above, and I'll call it hobby list. It's going to extend React component. And just like our other component, we'll need a render method. Now I want this component to take care of the rendering of that hobby list. So I'll first grab this array from the pet and put it here. And next I'll take this code and use that as our render. And I want to return that JSX. Let me just format that a little nicer. Okay, so now we have 2 components, our hobby list and our pet. But so far, the pet doesn't actually render the hobby list. So how do we get that hobby list to be rendered inside of our pet again? Well, we just used the JSX component. So it's called hobby list up here. I can just put a hobby list right inside this component. And this is really the power of React. We're composing a more complicated component, in this case the pet component, out of a simpler component, the simpler component being the hobby list. So this is what we'll do throughout the course. We'll use multiple components to build up something larger and larger. And let's take a look at this in action one more time. It looks like I've got an error here, so let's debug. Okay, so style is not defined. I made a mistake. So inside this li, we were still using the style, but it's not defined in this component. So I also need to grab style out of here and use that one in here also. So now with that change, yep, my component's working and the errors are gone. That's all. We've rendered a list of JSX elements and we've used two different components to compose our app. Next up, we'll be looking into something called props, which makes our components more customizable.